Hello, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Divine Nobodies podcast. I'm your host, Eric Ajna, joined by the beautiful Jennifer Lynn. Jennifer, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a really beautiful Sunday so far. We have a really amazing show for you guys lined up today. And we'll get into all the really juicy details of exactly what that is. But how was your weekend?
It was really good. It was our anniversary this weekend, so.
Oh, yeah? What'd you guys do?
We went camping, just like a little one-day trip.
One-day trip?
Yeah, and fairly close, but there's like a little lake, and just to get out of our house. We're still quarantining, whole pandemic thing, so can't go far.
Yeah, did you guys do a tent thing?
No, we have an RV, so, we took the RV and we glamped, I guess. It wasn't really, it wasn't really camping.
Sometimes you got to do glamping though. I have a group of friends that I consider my soul family. We do the glamping thing, but it isn't with an RV. Yeah. I think it just depends because glamping can mean a lot of different things. Our version of that is like, we'll bring electronic devices out into nature. We'll have like something like a projector.
Yeah.
We'll like play some movies and we'll, all sit together and kind of do that whole thing. We'll even bring sometimes like DJ equipment out there and just start a little dance party.
Yeah. I like it.
Because I feel really supported by nature. And I feel like, although nature kind of just does what it does and does this really, really fantastic job at keeping you present with it. I feel like if I were a tree and, some natives came into my city every now and again and just threw a party, I'd feel like they'd enjoy that celebration.
Hey, I like it.
What I mean? Yeah. So did you guys like barbecue and do that whole thing?
Yeah. We barbecued. We did that whole thing. We ended up cutting our trip short because we had some interesting things pop up on our Ring camera.
Oh,
so yeah.
Ring cameras. It's crazy because those things, I have family members that have that. I myself don't actually have a Ring camera, but some of the stuff that people pick up on Ring cameras.
It's amazing for just this little security camera, how sensitive they are.
Yeah.
I was actually pretty blown away, and we have multiple. We have them on the outside of our house and then a couple on the inside. We have one in our downstairs living area so we can keep an eye on the dogs.
Yeah.
So whenever we're not home, we kind of lock them in there and then they have a dog door where they can go in and out of the backyard.
Yeah. So. Whenever I go down to my family's house, I know that they both, my mom and my sister, I go to their houses and visit, they both have Ring cameras, but I always see it when I walk in. Mm-hmm. And it obviously senses motion at the front.
Yeah.
And so I always take that opportunity to just sort of do a little jig, like a little dance.
Yeah.
And
so it'll pick you up.
Exactly. So she sees it and she shares it with me. And I think they get kind of like a kick out of that.
Oh yeah. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Those little cameras are pretty amazing.
Yeah. It's cool that you guys found some time to get out of the house and spend some time together during that time.
Yeah.
For the most part, I think a lot of us are still in quarantine. And I was actually thinking about a story. Not a story. It's going to be a story for you guys, but I was introspecting the other day about a series of different, I would consider mystical states that I had experienced back in 2012. And of course, the energy back in 2012 was pretty heightened because you had the precession of the equinoxes going on. And there were a lot of people that were sort of tuned in to this sort of mass awakening that was happening as a result of the sort of Mayan calendar thing.
Yeah.
Right. And I was getting really into meditation as well as plant medicine. And I recall a series of visions that I had during meditation of what I would, and we'll get into it now. So it was actually, when I would get into these certain states of meditation, I think most people go through this at some point where you're falling deeper in. And a sort of byproduct of the meditative state is that some people just experience those really devout levels of peace and presence, but some people actually sort of catalyze these mystical type of states. Some people can fall really deep into an astral projection or sort of like almost like a lucid dream type of state.
Yeah.
And some people can actually recollect past lives and they do a lot of ancestral work.
Yeah.
So it's almost like when you're tapped into the meditative state, your spirit and your aura sort of expands and these sort of things can happen. But I recall several different experiences where I was sitting and I want to say maybe 30, 40 minutes. And I started getting these visions, started getting these downloads of a desolate street and particularly like a desolate freeway. So it almost had this like post-apocalyptic type of vibe to it, because you see those movies, I think like Will Smith did a movie a while back called I Am Legend.
Yeah.
And it was basically like
great movie.
And it was him sort of trying to exist in this post-apocalyptic world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually a pandemic was the result of that happening.
Yeah, it was. Mm-hmm.
Right? So that is also sort of like a synchronistic thing. So in this vision that I had, I remember walking down a highway, and the highway was completely empty, completely void of life. And it also did that sort of thing where like whenever you're in this sort of metropolitan or city area, once it stops being catered to by, you know, landscapers and just the city doing work on it, those plants start to flourish. So I got this vision of walking down a desolate highway, and obviously something happened. Right. And I'm trying to look at, sit with the sort of symbolic interpretation of exactly what that meant. But when this whole quarantine started, maybe it's not so much that way now. In some cities, depending on where you live, you might experience this, but there's nobody on the streets, you know? And when it first started, there wasn't really anybody on the highways either. You know? So I became really fascinated with just abandoned buildings, this feeling of just being completely on my own in this space. And it was completely void of life. And do I think that some sort of cataclysm happened that annihilated everybody except for myself? No, I don't think that. But my spiritual interpretation of that is there is an event, a large event that happened that became sort of the catalyst for obviously a huge change. So that was like me pulling that tower in the tarot. You know, and I started thinking of, well, what's the association or the correspondence with that? Well, light work. Right. And obviously there are a lot of different influencers and light workers and thought leaders and healers that are really banding together at this time to share their wisdom and try and really anchor in their light, especially during the time that we're in right now, because there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of, you know, really dense energy. The polarities are so strong right now.
They are.
You know what I mean?
Yes. In every aspect of my life, I feel like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And they're so clear. And you can, you know, depending on what your modality is, you could tune in to the television, you could watch the news, you could go onto social media. It's literally everywhere.
Yeah, it really
You
is.
have these sort of almost like these sides that people are taking, maybe advertently and inadvertently, where you have the shadow just completely illuminating itself, and it's also backed by this unbelievable light. You know, that contrast is starting to become so intense that people in a lot of ways are having to sort of choose a side. And a lot of those people that have been sort of flying under the radar, as far as like in the government or even in this spiritual dimension, a lot of those people are kind of coming to the surface. And I think that's where a lot of that light work is coming in, is like I guess from our perspective, this is really a great time and an opportunity for us to band together and sort of anchor in that light, especially when all the chaos is going on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, with all that you mentioned, all of the political figures coming to light, and you know, maybe some celebrities like Epstein, and that spawned the whole,
and that's a
you
thing.
know, Wayfair Gate.
Did you hear about that Wayfair thing?
That's crazy.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah,
I went on the links and, you know, tried to like verify the information, and the links were already taken down
because Wayfair took them down.
Right. So
I mean, but you don't have to. You don't really have to know a whole lot in order to kind of get a vibe that something bad is going on.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
no, I agree.
$12,000-$15,000 cabinets.
Right. Yeah.
And they're all the same, but different prices. That is unbelievable.
Yeah. And then there was a pillow that was on one of these streams, and the pillow was like $18.
The Constellation pillow.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you type in the field a name, and then it changes the price to 10,000.
Yeah.
I was like, well.
Yeah. And who charges that much for a pillow? Like I've seen that same pillow at like Ross for like $10.
Right.
You know
exactly.
what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's obviously something going on.
Yeah. There's something going on.
And people are intuitive. We live in this age of information where, you know, if something circulates on the internet, people are going to do their research. And I feel like people are doing that.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm really grateful that we have this community of people that are paying attention to this type of thing, because it's not a good thing. You know, human trafficking, I feel like, has been going around for a long time.
Yeah.
And those people that have been flying under the radar, just like I was talking about before, these are the people that are creating that contrast. And these are the people that we really, really need to pay attention to and make sure that justice is, of course, served for all of the innocent people that have been subject to this type of thing.
You know, this brought back a memory of being in the airport, in the Houston Intercontinental Airport. In the women's restroom, whenever you close the door, there's actually a sign, and it's a super generic phone number, like 22222, you know, something like that would be easy to remember. And it says, if you're being trafficked, remember this phone number. If you get an opportunity, call us. So, you know, they could help rescue some of these people that are going through one of these larger international airports.
Right.
It's crazy.
Yeah. It's super crazy. And you talked about those sort of numbers that are actually coming up. I'm noticing a lot of sort of synchronistic numbers. I feel like we are approaching a really, really integral time in our universe right now. Right. And I feel like we're getting a lot of support from the angelic realms, as well as from our spirit guides. And they're showing themselves in a multitude of different ways. From, I guess, the more spiritual dimension, they communicate in ones and zeros. So if you're seeing, you know, these synchronistic numbers like 1111 or 1212, it's really important to pay attention to these things, because this is how angels and guides communicate with us in the astral realm. And at the same time, whenever you have a contrast this large, especially the density is the dimensions are definitely open. And I feel like the veil is becoming so thin.
I agree.
And just the same way that we are bringing in all of this light, there's also just an admixture of the opposite on our planet right now. So I feel like as light workers, it's really a responsibility to do the work in helping in any way that we can, but also doing the work on ourselves, because that's the one thing that we have the ability to change.
Right.
And I think that's really what this is about. This is an inward revolution. And that involves really just sitting with yourself and going over the various levels of conditioning that we find ourselves subject to. And right now is the perfect opportunity to do that, because that quarantine is still happening. And there are a lot of people that are spending a lot of time with themselves that have normally probably got involved more into the nightlife, people that would go out normally on weekends and partying. And now a lot of those people aren't able to do that. You know, in the beginning, in beginning stages of it happening, you know, people can go for quite some time without having those things. But I think we're approaching kind of like a precipice where you're starting to see how it wears on people.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
which brings up, quarantine alone brings up so many different questions and possibilities, but you think about people that are in relationships with like domestic violence situations and they don't have anywhere else to go, and they're like trapped in their house. And then what that means for the night people, like you were just talking about in Vegas, how those people typically only work through the summers, at the pool parties and whatever. And that supplies them their income for the rest of the year. So
I was watching this,
different ways.
This YouTube talk by Marianne Williamson, and I ascribe to her because she has a really amazing book called The Return to Love, and she talks really, for the most part, about the Course in Miracles. And she had made a talk right around the time quarantine started about just the spiritual, emotional, and physical implications of what we're going through right now. And a lot of people during this time are trying to maintain some level of normalcy, but you'll hear that sort of statement come from people sometimes, like, I just want things to go back to normal. And she says that normal is what got us here. Right? So we can't go back to those various types of behaviors that really led to us really getting to this point. You know, yes, it was initially about a pandemic, but this is about so many different things. This is about the lack of compassion and our indifference to really important things that are happening in the world, all sort of combined together. You know what I mean? It can even come down to, obviously, socio and economic statuses and income inequality and, the corruption that we have in our government systems.
Right.
But she was talking about we're going through a collective dark night of the soul. And I think we talked about really briefly in some of our previous podcasts about how each individual person goes through that, but we are as a collective going through it as a civilization of people that are coming to terms with the fact that we've been doing a lot of crazy shit and not taking accountability for the crazy shit that we do and the crazy shit that we do to each other. Right. So it's really a form of divine grace because nature is also involved.
Oh yeah.
Right. And, you know, for the most part, all of us consist of bodies, and our bodies consist of various different minerals. And we ultimately come from Mother Gaia and Pachamama, and we'll ultimately return to her. And so this can be looked at as a form of divine grace because nature is involved, and nature is putting us in our places. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we are pretty much being forced into this state of having to introspect and really pay attention to how our behavior has been affecting not only each other, but just the planet.
Right.
You know? And so I talked about this really briefly what the dark night of the soul is on a collective level, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about the individual dark night of the soul, because although we are going through it collectively, it's also going to narrow itself down to us individually doing the work.
Right.
You know, and I think the dark night of the soul happens when there's something that sort of sparks that attention.
Right.
And it could be trauma. It could be venturing through plant medicines. It could be meditation. It could be the death of a loved one.
Right.
Right. And we all experience it very differently. But from my experience, when it comes to the spiritual path, there's always a catalyst. Right. And the dark night of the soul is basically the glimpse into what we consider to be truth. Right. It's like seeing through the veils of the matrix.
Right.
And realizing, one, that you're not just a human being, but that you're a spirit. Right. And a dark night of the soul is a really integral time in our spiritual development because you go through this sort of ego death. Maybe ego death isn't the right word to say because we can't completely annihilate the ego. Right. But it's creating the separation between the spirit and the ego. And once you see the truth, and Adyashanti has this quote that says, it's not that enlightenment does anything to you. All enlightenment does is shows you the truth about how reality works. Right. And once you see the truth, you have no choice but to change.
Exactly.
And once those doors open, you can't close them.
You can't close them.
You know what I mean?
It's like finding out there's no Santa Claus.
Exactly. That's another thing too. Finding out there's no Santa Claus.
Yeah, that was bullshit.
Yeah, it's total bullshit, right? We're obviously getting older, and we know people that have children. And, you know, now that I'm older and I realize that Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy are bullshit, I feel just this overwhelming sense of compassion and love for these children because they're sort of going to go down that dark path of one day finding out that it's not real. Yeah. You know what I mean?
That was it's that you realize you've been lied to. Yeah. And it's, even as a little kid, you really connect with that. You're like, wait a second. You don't care that who's bringing you the presents as long as you're getting the presents, right? Right. So that is a moot point. It's more that like, wait a minute, these people have been orchestrating this big show and lying to me this whole time. That's how I felt.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And the funny thing is I was actually watching a movie with one of my nieces over the weekend. Okay. And it's always like it reminds me of this quote by Ram Dass where he's like, you think you're enlightened, try spending a weekend with your parents.
Amen.
Although I'm not spending a weekend with my parents, I was spending a weekend with a child that does not give a shit about spirituality. Right. Not because they don't care. It's just because they're not in that place to know. Yeah. And in some ways they're actually more spiritual than us because they are fully tapped in and tuned into their innocence. Right. But the one thing that I realized just sitting there with her watching this movie is why is it that children have this content? When you're a child, suddenly there are things that you just gravitate towards as a children. And we as adults consider them to just be little kid stuff. Right. You have these Pixar movies, these DreamWorks movies, things like that. And we say, okay, those are kid movies. Why do kids have this affinity towards these sort of like cartoony type of things that we would consider to be innocent and playful? Right. And it was really profound because I realized that they come into this world and right away, their innocence obviously is flourishing, They're coming directly from heaven, and they have that sort of creative spark and creative impulse of the divine spirit in them. So right when they get here, you get a glimpse of what God may actually be like, right? Because children have one of the greatest imaginations, right? The scenarios and the stories, like they believe and are fully tapped into a world that we as adults tend to lose grasp of, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that I was just thinking about is like, it's also their attempt to try and come to terms with the fact that that world isn't the way that it is. So they get into this sort of this realm of having to play make-believe and having to, in some ways, escape the seriousness of what it means to be alive here on this planet. That's why, you know, maybe girls play with dolls and guys play with, you know, whatever toys that they play with. And they're always creating these scenarios of a more magical, a more innocent, a more beautiful life. And
so
I think the reason why they do that is because when you are a child and you're born into this world and you're surrounded by a bunch of different adults, you realize that the innocence sort of in some ways dies away. So it's their way of coping with the intensity and the seriousness of what adults sort of make reality into after a certain point.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's the interesting thing about it is like that sort of, I guess the natural movement of karma as we get older is we are children, we grow up, we start taking on these sort of conceptual forms of who we should be as adults. And at a certain point, we start realizing that that isn't it.
Right.
That isn't where the freedom is. That isn't where, you know, love really flows. But we have to get to that point and go through that journey in order to realize that. But once you get to that point, you start trailing backwards and you start subtracting. Suddenly, I'm 35 years old trying to get back to the state and the emotional sort of state that children are in.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And they say that that's one of the signs that you're going through this process, right, is that you will conjure up old memories as a child that maybe you had blocked out, and those memories will start to reappear as you become more awakened. Yeah. So.
It's almost like the natural flow that I think the spirit goes through is it needs to get to this peak where it realizes that it doesn't need everything that it thought it needed before, and it starts to go backwards. I think the story that comes up for me is like my mom or your parents, because we were obviously children of them, where when we were young, our parents, for the most part, had to set the pace for how we developed as children.
Right.
Right. That involved rules. It involved, you know, discipline. It involved, you know, them creating this past that led us into being contributing members to society. And when I think back about my mother and my family, there were times where they were very stern, right? They have to be as parents. Right. But we identify them when we're young as being sort of the end all be all of everything. They know everything. Yeah. Right?
They are the master of your universe.
They're the master of your universe. And I didn't just think of parents that way. I thought of every adult that way. Right. You know, and I think I told you this story before. It's like when I was young, I used to look through a window and see adults working in their office doing what I imagine adult human beings to be doing. Yeah. Now that I'm older, I look through that same window and I see a bunch of kids doing what they think adults do. Right. And they never quite get at it because I'm 35 and I still don't feel like I'm quite there yet.
No. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. My dad says that, and he's an old man, you know? Yeah. He says that when I look in the mirror, I'm like, oh, holy shit, who's that old guy? He said, because in my mind, I still feel like I'm 18, 21 years old. Yeah. And then I don't know anything. I'm still just learning so much. And
then that's a part of like that whole, we even find out that we've been lied to when we get older too. Yeah. Just on a different scale. Yeah. And the reason why I brought up my mom is that I'm obviously an adult now and I can take care of myself. And after a certain point, parents realize that they don't have to parent you in the way that they used to anymore. Right. And the older that I get, I'm noticing how much more innocent and how much more childlike my mother's starting to become. Right? Because what exactly happens when a parent decides to have a child, right? Right away, you fall into that role of, okay, now I have to be a parent. Mm-hmm. Now I have to sort of set maybe my wants and my desires aside. Mm-hmm. And that's a compassionate act. Right. They do that out of love for their child, right? But there's this childlike energy in them, that maybe that teenager, maybe that young adult, that doesn't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. It kind of stays there. And they're able to, express that throughout various levels of their bringing you up. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I'm noticing about her, now that she doesn't have to play the parent role, it's almost like she went backwards into her.
Yeah. She got to take her parent hat off and put her, I can't remember your mom's name. What's her name? Susan. Put her Susan hat back on, and she's like, hey, now I can be me. Yeah. Which is cool. It does change the dynamic of the relationship with your parents too, right. And how you connect with them as you get older. Mm-hmm. And I love my relationship with my parents now. Yeah. I think it's amazing. Way better than when I was younger, because you're in that, like they're your dictator right. pretty much until you're 18. Right. So yeah. So now it's good. We both have our own lives, do our own things. And right. now it's just kind of hanging out with an old friend. Yeah. Yeah. And then once you get to a certain age where you maybe meet them on maturity, and then you realize that we're all just doing the best that we can. Yeah. We don't all have it figured out, but there's actually some peace and some compassion that we can feel in that, because mm-hmm. at the end of the day, we're all just, like I said, we're all just doing the best that we can. But right. the beautiful thing about the reason why I brought up my mom is that she seems more childlike now. Aww. Because she went from being that serious adult right. to now all of a sudden it's kind of going backwards. And the more I see her, the older that I get, the more innocent mm-hmm. and the more, immature, but in a cute way, she starts to become. Right. And all of a sudden we're at like family gatherings, and I'm having to tell her to watch her mouth. Yeah. You know what I mean? Right. We're having to tell her to kind of like, hey, you need to relax a little bit. You know what I mean? But it's like, they earn their right to do that. Yeah. But it's interesting how the evolution of the human spirit, it's like we go into this having to take life so seriously mm-hmm. into finally working out and experiencing that brass ring mm-hmm. and then realizing that really at the end of the day, it all just comes back to love and innocence and fun. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what the dark night of the soul really signifies, is that for those of you, I said this a lot in the podcast so far, the dark night of the soul is when there is a catalyst, when there is a specific situation in your life. Maybe it could have been a breakup. It could have been a death of a loved one, mm-hmm. but it shatters your entire perception of what reality is mm-hmm. in the same way that maybe this serious world shatters a child's perception of what magic mm-hmm. and wonder is like. Mm-hmm. And once you experience that as an adult, you realize that all the concepts and all the things that you believed in, even in religion, even in spirituality, are put into question. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Your entire foundation is removed from underneath you, and you go from a place of being absolutely certain that you understand the world a certain way to all of a sudden, I don't know shit. Yeah. And then you're starting to experience these other changes, like mm-hmm. you're socially, maybe you're less inclined to want to impress people, and right. then you want to connect with people more. And then you start searching for that inner child, and, right. Your life starts to take a different direction. And sometimes that's really scary for people when they're experiencing this. Yeah, absolutely. They're like, why am I like this? Why am I changing like this? And maybe their old social groups are asking them the same question, and that's a hard thing to answer. Right. It's almost like the soul ventures as far as it can away from that sort of divine spark of love, mm-hmm. does its own thing because it thinks that it's separate from the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. That's where the duality comes in. It's largely something that's moderated by our Western society, because it, for the most part, teaches us how to think that we are different from everybody else. So we don't automatically feel that sense of oneness with people mm-hmm. that are around us. Mm-hmm. Right. But once you experience truth, once you experience this sort of like divine intervention of God coming into your life and completely destroying your house, mm-hmm. Everything changes. Everything changes. And we think that when God or source comes in, that he's just going to come in and rearrange our furniture. Yeah, no. But he's not. Oh, it's coming down.
He's going to come in and he's just going to destroy your entire house and replace it with a sprinter van. You know what I mean?
Right.
Maybe
it's like, you don't need all that.
Yeah. You don't need all that.
Yeah.
It's like maybe you won't be a van lifer. Maybe some people would.
Yeah.
I feel like Elon Musk is also going down that path.
Yeah, he totally is.
Yeah. Cause I saw that interview with Joe Rogan, and he was talking about, like, at some point he had all these houses. He even had Gene Wilder's house. Mm-hmm. Right. That's cool as fuck.
That's pretty cool.
Gene
That's
Wilder's
pretty fucking cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Right. And now he's getting rid of all of his houses.
Yeah.
He's selling everything.
Yeah. He said, and he was talking about building a new house and like, no, I don't really want to occupy my mind with that. I want to go to Mars instead.
Yeah.
Like, that's a better use of my time.
Yeah. And he also is
like,
going to be renting too.
Yeah. I think that's cool.
So if anybody's out there that's listening, if Elon Musk figures out that the truth of how reality works, then trust me, like that brass ring that people are looking for doesn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that's the same thing with people like Jim Carrey. Mm-hmm. You know, it just shows that no matter how famous you are, that wealth and that money will not make you happy.
Nope.
It isn't going to drive the ship for you. Maybe it might for a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. But even famous people that have everything they could possibly imagine get to that point of realizing that there's something else moving through our universe. And there's something else that has really the power over any type of material wealth. And that's basically love. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when that dark night of the soul happens, it's always difficult as to how to navigate through it, because I see it as you understand finally the truth that what you believed in has been a lie. Mm-hmm. But you haven't yet fully evolved into the awakened spirit yet.
Right.
So you're kind of stuck between the doorway.
Yeah. You're still doing some research.
Yeah. You're still doing the research. And what ends up happening, I think, from my own experience, is that panic comes because there's this fear of uncertainty.
Oh yeah.
And that's the one thing that the ego has a hard time with, is not knowing what's going to happen. So what do? We ascribe to some level of faith or truth. And for the most part, from my experience, people become fanatics. Mm-hmm. You go from one side of the spectrum of being a consumer to all of a sudden being addicted to spirituality. Right. And it's almost like what Ram Dass calls the phony holy and the phony unholy. Yeah. Right. Where it's like you take this premature step and dive into spirituality because you want something to hold on to. Yeah. Right. And so you ascribe to all of these different types of faiths. It doesn't have to necessarily even be the New Age faith. It can be Buddhism, Hinduism, anything. Yeah. Right. So we develop this sort of fanaticism towards it as a way to sort of cope with the fact that our world is crumbling around us. Mm-hmm. So that's where you get into, the bells and whistles and the shiny and polished version of spirituality, which is, okay, now I have to be just super unbelievably happy all the time.
Yeah. Why do people think that?
It's an innocent thing. It's tempting to want to be happy all the time when we're surrounded by a lot of situations that don't make us happy. Yeah. Right. And I think it's just really about finding balance. Mm-hmm. And it's about, that pendulum swinging too far in each direction. Right.
Yeah. The highs can't be too high. The lows can't be too low. So you just got to learn how to regulate.
Right. And I think, and then on the spiritual journey, it's really about how to moderate the ego, because the ego is the one that the second it experiences truth, it could be, something somebody experiences on plant medicine where they get to experience source. Mm-hmm. There's this impulse that moves through you, which I actually call it the divine impulse of God. And once you've experienced God, and that can come through as just devout levels of bliss or just divine clarity, there's this feeling that you've been chosen to do a very specific type of work. Right. And I think a lot of us really are, but within reason. Mm-hmm. It can be something really as practical as just being a good person and being loving in all the dimensions that you have the ability to be loving. Mm-hmm. But then there are some people that kind of tread into this sort of Messiah complex realm, right? Where suddenly the universe is on your shoulders and you are the one responsible for bringing in the Great Awakening. And you have to be really careful with that because the ego will take that and run with it.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
seen some Instagram accounts. I can tell you that's happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you don't want to do it as a form of external validation.
Right.
You don't want to do it as a way of coping with your own sort of insecurity with the game that's going on.
Exactly.
And that's what I say. The dark night of the soul is really about finally seeing the way that the ego works and realizing that as long as you're feeding it some sort of concept or some sort of practice, what the ego is going to do is it's going to take it and try and compartmentalize it and try and personify it.
Right.
You know, and the ego is a really tricky thing. There was a talk that I listened to a while back by Muji, and he says, the ego is something we put so much trust in, right? But the ego is that one voice that you hear inside of your mind that's like, oh, you should put your hand on the fire. It'll be okay.
Right.
It'll be okay. And then you put your hand on the fire and you get burned. And then that same ego is going to be like, I told you not to do that.
Yeah.
I told you not to do this.
You know it's hot. Why'd you do that?
Exactly. So that's the sort of trickery that goes on.
Right.
When we're not operating from awareness, is that we always want to create a process and we always want to personify something that really has no place for that type of personification, because source is such a universal force and it's such an all-encompassing force. And we get into trouble when we, put ourselves in situations that create division between us and other people, in the same way that, it's like when people think of heaven, like, let's just talk about like Christianity for a second.
Okay.
And when we die, people think of this sort of biblical heaven, where it's like you're sitting in the clouds and you're just singing hymns all day long. I don't know who you are, but if I spoke to anybody on the street, they would not want to do that.
Right.
Every single day.
Every day.
For eternity.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
That sounds like hell to me.
Right. Yeah. And the reason why we have this sense of goodness and this sense of happiness is because we have the contrast of understanding all the things that don't make us happy.
Right.
So that, I think, points to balance needing to exist. Right? Like it's not about, I don't think the spiritual journey is about being happy all the time.
Yeah, no.
And
I think part of it is digging into those times that you're unhappy to see where the source is and what you need to work on. I mean, that's how you identify what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I think it's about creating a utopian society that like maybe Aldous Huxley talks about in Brave New World? No, because ultimately that didn't end up actually working out.
Right.
It's really about transformation. It's really about the journey to source.
Yeah. And
in the same way, when we go to see a choir, for example, like say you go to see a symphony, say you go to see a band, maybe Soundgarden's still playing music, right?
Oh, that'd be so wonderful.
You don't go to see Soundgarden or Nako and Medicine for the People or Odessa. You don't go to that show just to hear the finale.
Right.
Right? Because otherwise you would just go and hear one crashing chord and that would be it.
And that'd be it.
The whole reason why people enjoy going to these shows is the journey getting there, the journey listening to all the different songs that have all these beautiful memories and experiences attached to them, being with your friends. Ultimately, the journey is the one reason why we appreciate anything. Right? And that journey doesn't always look the best. It doesn't always look like the most shiny thing, So I feel like the whole point of our existence is about trying to understand ourselves in a more cohesive and a more beautiful way, which is basically understanding how God moves within each and every person.
Right. I mean, you just can't have the rainbow without the rain.
Exactly.
You have to have some rain in your life to really understand and appreciate it.
Right. Yeah. So the dark night of the soul, that's the first part of, I think, what Ram Dass was talking about when he says the phony holy, where we prematurely take this step into spirituality without actually doing the work to get there, to that place.
Right.
Because what'll end up happening is you'll step into that realm and you'll realize that you're still seeking. You'll realize that you're still seeking that salvation.
Right.
In the same way that you were seeking wealth.
Right.
In your 3D realm. Right. And you go through this really great bout of depression because you realize what you were looking for is not there. And it's because you were going through the wrong door.
Right.
So what happens is you bounce back. You say, okay, well, this spiritual thing wasn't for me, so I'm just going to go back and try and maintain some level of normalcy in my life by going back to do the things that I did before. Mm-hmm. And then you realize that once you open the door, you can't close it. So you go and you start taking on these roles of like, okay, well, I'm going to go back and try and party and do all the things that I used to do. But there's this feeling of like, okay, now I feel even more empty. Now I feel like I'm lying to myself.
Right.
And then that's when the phony, unholy thing happens, where it's like you've awakened to the truth. And because you were seeking a certain type of outcome, you went back to being who you were, but then realized that your old self was not there anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's like being a kid and finding out there's no Santa Claus. It's that you're losing that innocence again. That's like when it snaps you out and you're like, oh, wait a second.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then that's where the dark night of the soul happens, because you're right in between the realms.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, if you are, being really sincere and honest about your journey, and your world is obviously completely destroyed, and the world that you imagine to be true, then all really the spiritual journey asks is for this radical honesty to take place between yourself and your spirit. Right. Between your mind and your heart. And once you start being honest with who you are, you'll start realizing that the seeking is this sort of, it's the spirit's way of running away from the truth of what is, because you realize at a certain point that you are that, like you are God. And that can scare a lot of people. But at the same time, it's not complex enough for people to understand that. Right. Because we've been trained for the most part growing up that it all looks a certain way. That Jesus is going to come in the clouds, or like, the lightning bolt's going to come out of the sky and zap me with this sort of like omnipotent sort of force. And all of a sudden I'm going to get that aha moment where it's like, and that. Right. But it's really such a practical, such a subtle thing that you can miss it. Right? And it reminds me of this story of the diamond thief. And I won't go in too far into this story, but you'll probably like this story. It's basically, there's this world-renowned diamond thief, goes around picking people's pockets. One day he sees this person walking out of a diamond store, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go after that person, take the diamond out of their pocket. So he goes, and he's like looking through this person's pockets, can't find a diamond anywhere. Looks everywhere. Eventually he gets frustrated and he pokes the person on the shoulder and is like, hey, I'm a world-renowned diamond thief. I've been doing this shit for years. And for the life of me, I can't figure out where you put this diamond. And this person turns to him and he's like, I knew you were looking for it. So I put it in the one place I knew you wouldn't look for it. He's like, in your pocket. Right. And that's how, for the most part, we approach spirituality. Right. We're looking for all these different areas outside of ourselves for the answers. We don't realize that we are the answer. Like a knife can cut many things, but it can't cut itself. Yeah. Right. And a mouth can bite many things, but it can't bite itself. We are looking for this place, not even realizing that we are already operating from that place. Yeah.
And people look for it in other people and relationships and unhealthy addictions, whether that's alcohol or drugs or even food. I mean, just that constant searching of something that's going to make them happy. Right. And it's,
And it's not to say that we shouldn't indulge in things that make us happy, but I think it's tough because the ego, unless you are fully integrated with your ego and you understand balance, it's always going to go running for, the highest peak of that experience. It's like this adrenaline junkie that just wants to just max out and go super extra on everything, And so it's really about trying to maintain that balance. Right. And so how do you do that? Well, meditation is a really good place to start. Like meditation, that's another completely different thing. But I'd like to, if I can, demystify meditation.
I would love for you to do that, because that's probably the most commonly asked question from people that know that I'm into spirituality. They'll ask me, how do you meditate? And to me, it seems so obvious and so simple, but I remember the first time I tried to meditate, and the only thing that I could think about was like the laundry that I forgot to put in the dryer, what I needed to do tomorrow. I was hungry, what I wanted to eat, what somebody said to me at work. I mean, all of this stuff that was so not important. Right. But those memories come flooding through your mind, and you just have to kind of sweep them aside and refocus. And it seems obvious, but it's not obvious. I think people really need to know that just because you're having thoughts doesn't mean you're doing it wrong.
Right. Exactly. And the beautiful thing about what you're saying is everybody goes through that. Every single person. There isn't one person. If we're a part of this Western world, I mean, even in the East, it's always been the biggest problem. But you can find peace and love in the fact that everybody approaches it the same way.
Right.
Right. So you're definitely not alone. Right. But the interesting thing, when I'm doing some of my sound healing classes, and I was one of these people as well, it's like your first inclination when it comes to meditation, well, how do you do that?
Right.
Like, how do you meditate? And it's not as obvious that the question is the reason why you can't.
Right.
Right. Because your ego is trying to develop this way of creating a process out of something that fundamentally doesn't have a process.
Right.
So when someone tells you that there's not a process to meditate, all of a sudden you're left with this blank of like,
what do you mean?
Like, what do you mean? Right.
And then you're Googling instructions on how to meditate.
You're Googling instructions, which, by the way, and I think we talked about a little bit about this with the episode with Ryan, is that that's not to say that the instructions to meditate aren't useful.
Yeah.
There are guided meditations that Deepak Chopra has, Marianne Williamson has. I mean, they're useful, very, very useful.
Good. Yeah.
But at a certain point, when you go deeper into meditation, you realize it's not as really complicated as you think. You can use guided meditations as like a nice guiding post. Some people need it. There are some people that just need a process.
Right.
But as far as meditation, like the human spirit is always trying to rest in the state of meditation at all times. So fundamentally, at the very core, you're never not in meditation. The only thing that happens is you develop these ways of bringing yourself out of the meditative state. And that and those ways being the concepts you have about what it means to meditate, the ideas that you have about how life works. Basically, anything that takes you away from the present moment that you're in is what takes you out of meditation.
Right.
But if me and you are just sitting here and if me and you are sitting here and we're just being present with what it is that we're doing, there's really no need to develop any sort of practice on top of that. There's this intuitive knowing in your mind that in every given moment, there's an appropriate action and reaction to everything. And morality doesn't come into that. It's just about doing by naturally being. And I think I talked about this in a couple podcasts ago where it was when I was talking about nature. And the beautiful thing about plants in nature is that they just so effortlessly do what they do. And they're not thinking about how it is that they do it or what it is that they're doing or whether or not they're being quiet enough and things like that. Yeah. That's the beautiful thing about nature is that it doesn't have a story and it just effortlessly does what it does. Now, there is like a certain point where human beings need to access their mind in order to learn new things, right? But eating, for example, it's like there's something in us that intuitively knows when it's time to eat.
Right.
And there are probably some of us that will sit and think about for like an hour what it is that they want to eat. If there's a Libra inside of me, it's difficult for me to make a decision when it comes to eating things sometimes.
Right.
Because whenever there's like one place that I can go, I always automatically choose the second.
Yeah.
And so it's always about trying to balance the two.
Oh,
do you go through that?
Yes, all the time. Or I'll order something and somebody else will order also my second choice.
Yeah.
And then when their food comes, I have food envy because I wish I would have ordered my second choice and not what I ordered.
Oh, that happens. That's the thing. But you know what? From my experience, that happens in relationships, obviously.
Yeah, it does.
Right. And maybe you can shed more light on this because when I was in a relationship, it always came down to eating.
Yeah.
It was always like, okay, we decide on a certain place.
There's a production.
It's an ordeal.
It is.
Right? It's an ordeal because you're sitting in front of the menu and you're like, okay, I want to get, your partner my partner at the time, they start telling you what it is. Oh, that looks good. You want to get that?
Yeah.
Right. And you're like, I don't know, maybe I should.
Maybe.
I didn't even realize that they were sort of subconsciously trying to get me to get that so they can have some. Right. That is like a thing.
That's a thing.
Right.
That's a thing.
And
we're pretty upfront about it though.
Really?
Yeah. I'm like, you get the fish and I'll get the steak and we'll have a surf and turf. We'll like share,
yeah,
you know, like
that's what I do now. I feel like maybe that's like a sign of maturity because now, you know, when I'm in relationships or I'm dating, it's always like, I think we're at that place, especially if you're in the spiritual community where you're like, let's share.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because it's like, one, when you're going out to eat, I mean, I don't know about you, but some of these fucking entrees are humongous.
Huge.
They're huge.
Huge.
They're enough for two people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so it's like, I mean, I don't eat that much, but it's like, you might as well share.
Yeah.
You know, and there's really no harm in, you know, sharing 2 entrees.
No.
But I just noticed when we're in the drive-through, we're at a restaurant, it's always like, okay, I finally get what it is that or you run into the situation where it's like, oh, do you want fries? And they're like, no, I don't want fries. You can have fries. And I'm like, all right, are you sure you don't want fries? And you're like, yeah. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to get some fries. And you get the fries and then they end up eating them.
Yes.
Right?
And you're like, I would have got more fries if I knew you were going to eat my fries.
Yeah, exactly. So what is it? Is that like just an unwillingness to commit? Is it like this feeling of like, okay, well, if he gets the fries and I don't, then I don't have to deal with the guilt of actually eating them?
Yes, you got it. You got it. And it's like, well, I didn't get my own fries. I just had a couple of his, but really you had like 75% of his.
Yeah, I just couldn't commit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, yeah. We do that.
I had this like habit for a while where it doesn't matter what it is that I was eating, but I would never finish the last bite.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
And I did this for years. I don't do it anymore because I looked into it, but I wouldn't finish the last bite because I was able to somehow convince myself that I really wasn't that hungry.
Really?
Like it was like this way of saying like, it's almost like not fully committing to the, 1,500 calories that you eat.
It's like, well, if I don't eat that bite's probably worth 150 calories. So, I save myself a little bit.
Exactly.
And I'm not that hungry anymore.
So it's like you feel like you're doing yourself a solid.
Yeah. You've already scratched the itch because you ate what you wanted to eat.
Yeah. This is funny how those little behaviors that you, because I had, when I was a teenager, for whatever reason, I would only put $15 of gas in my gas tank at a time.
Right.
Because you need the money when you're a teenager. You know what I mean? But you're not really kidding yourself because you're ultimately going to have to just refill it. So it's just about how many times you really want to go to the gas pump.
Right.
So now I don't do that, but it's like you have these little rituals that you do.
Yeah.
And that was one of those things where,
but $15 when you're a kid is like a deal breaker.
That's true. But also,
back then, gas was only like 99 cents a gallon then too.
Yeah.
So it's not $4 a gallon anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking about basically just like meditation, right? So it's hard for the ego to not try and create a process out of something.
Right.
So right away, you're sitting down, you're easing into it, and all of a sudden you're dealing with this mind that's moving. And that mind is saying so many different things like, okay, well, is this what meditation looks like? Am I in meditation? What do I do with these thoughts? Like, what do I, and then
nothing's happening. Why isn't anything happening?
And it leads to more of the same thing.
Right.
So you get in this loop with your ego about whether or not you're meditating. And it becomes a cyclical thing. And it leads to more of the same thing. And then eventually you just get frustrated.
Yeah.
And some people are just like, meditation is just not for me.
Right.
And I think for the most part, everybody goes through that.
Yeah.
They continue their search of trying to find that sort of inner peace. And then maybe as the teaching starts to unravel yourself, you sort of give it another shot. And so when it comes to like meditation, I try not to look at it as a process. I try to look at it as just your most natural state to be in. Because if you're in your most natural state and you're being completely present with the moment, you won't need to get into this process of trying to quiet your mind because it'll just quiet itself.
Yeah.
Right. Trying to quiet the mind is like trying to calm smooth water with a flat iron. It just leads to more of the same thing.
Right.
So as far as meditation goes, it's really just about being present in your body and being present with what's in front of you. And that doesn't sound really complex. I think that's the reason why some people miss it.
Yeah.
Because it's basically just being okay with where you're at.
Right.
You know,
and the rewards of meditation are not immediate. I mean, it takes a while and practice before you start to see how meditation is changing your life. So that's the other part too, is everyone wants things to happen yesterday.
Right.
Like that instant gratification. Well, I did this for 20 minutes. I don't feel any different.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's not the point. Like,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I saw this talk by Simon Sinek. I don't know if
I
you
love
know
him.
Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
So he talks a lot about millennials in the workplace. And he talks a lot about leadership.
Yeah.
And he's talking about, I'm a millennial, right? I'm like right at the cusp of being a millennial. And I'm not ashamed to say that I have some millennial qualities, but definitely not lazy.
Yeah.
Right. But he was talking about, you know, that instant gratification is such a huge thing in our society. And the reason why that is because everything modern our universe gives you instant gratification. Like you can pick up your phone and basically get anything that you want within, you know, arm's distance and at your fingertips. Yeah. Like you can get food delivered here. If you want to date, you can just download a dating app, like literally anything quickly. Right. The amount of bandwidth, like it's immediate. Like it's something that just happens so quickly. Right. He was talking about like the instant gratification. We get so used to it. And it's no surprise that the millennials get used to it too. Right. Because they grew up in that world. You can't really blame them in some ways. Because you have this mixture of the baby boomers mixed in with the millennials and other generations that when we were young, we didn't have that luxury. So there's this, you know, side in us that inside in the baby boomers that are like, you still have to work and you still have to put in this amount of effort in order to get this type of result. Right. Well, the millennials have developed a more efficient way of getting that same result, just going through a different door and getting there a lot faster. And so it appears to baby boomers to be lazy, but to millennials to just be more efficient. Right. They're like, why should I do all of this work when I can just get to this really quickly? Yeah. Right. So the reason why I bring it up is because he was talking about how do you define leadership and how do you know when you're working, maybe in your office, or it could be in any aspect of your life where you start trusting your leadership. And he started talking about, well, when you work out, for example, like on a treadmill, and you work out for like a solid maybe 2 hours or 3 hours that day, and then you go after that workout and look in the mirror, what do you see? Nothing. There's no difference, right? So what happens the second day where you work out for 2 hours of the day, and then you look in the mirror and you see if anything's changed? Nothing. So it's about consistency. Right. And it's about after a certain point, 2, 3 months, 6 months down the line, all of a sudden there's this feeling in you that's like, whoa. When I guess in terms of love, it's like, oh, I love this person. Because we can't quantify the moment that somebody falls in love with somebody. It's like, you can't really think of like, oh, damn,
that's when.
That's exactly when it happens. Like one day you wake up and you're like, man, I love this person. Yeah. Like you know what I mean? Like it's all this, it's like this flower, this garden that you slowly nurtured and catered to for a certain period of time. And if you're looking at it every single day, you get frustrated because it's not growing. Right. After a certain point where you trust that the universe is going to flow in the way that it should, one day that garden blossoms. One day you wake up and you realize that you love this person. And then one day, you know, if you're somebody that needs the seeking in order to get to meditation, one day you realize that the seeking is what prevented you from getting there. Yeah. You know, and it's something really, really subtle and something just really, really, really kind of to the point, and it's all there. It's just we go looking in all the different places to find it. And eventually we just arrive right back to the place that we started. Right. And that's the beautiful thing, is that there's like this really beautiful correspondence that takes place because you can look at the spiritual journey in that way. That's just how nature sort of has everything in nature has this sort of cyclical sort of nature to it. You know, you can see that death, that life and death and rebirth sort of cycle. Yeah. In the way that the human spirit sort of moves through our planet. Yeah. You know? Yeah.
So true.
So if you guys are looking to meditate, yeah, you can go online and find different methods of meditating, but trust yourself because you are already in the state of meditation and you don't need to develop a process because the ego will automatically take that and want to create this sort of curriculum where it's like, oh, okay, well, now I know how to meditate. So I can do it Monday through Tuesday, and then I can have a siesta on Wednesday, and then I can go batshit crazy on Thursday and just like max out on the partying, and then I can get back to the meditation. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right.
Like we don't want to look at it that way.
Yeah.
You want to look at it as just, how do I always operate? And that's what people come up to Jiddu Krishnamurti and they ask him how to meditate. And he says that or he says that he's never not in meditation. Mm-hmm. He never stopped meditating.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
I like that.
Just sit with yourself, be present with yourself, and just really focus on what's in front of you. Mm-hmm. You know, like focus on all of your senses. I think that's a really good place to start too.
Yeah.
So listening to the sounds in the room, feeling the way that your fingertips feel on certain textures, mm-hmm. like looking with your eyes. It's all like Ryan actually brought it up in our podcast where he was like, look at this glass like you've never seen it before in your life.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's like it almost calls for you to look at something like a child would look at a new world.
Yeah. I actually have to have some kind of chant. I can't get into meditation without it.
Yeah.
Because that's what like slows my mind down. And then I'll stop it and it'll be complete silence. But, in the beginning, that's how I would get to where I need to be.
Yeah. And that's good. There are, mantras.
Yeah.
I do mantras sometimes too. Mm-hmm. Affirmations, mm-hmm. even just the sound of music,
right?
Whatever the catalyst for your venture into meditation is, I think my whole point is to just don't beat yourself up if you can't do it, because the journey into getting into that state of meditation is part of it, right?
Yeah. Don't worry about the kid knocking on the door. Don't worry about the dog barking. Yeah. You know, that's normal. That's normal life stuff that's going to happen. I mean, ideally you want to be in a calm, quiet place, but that's not real life, especially not in quarantine.
Exactly. And so, you know, we're bringing it up because we are in quarantine right now. And if anybody's looking for a way to really balance and recenter the energy, like as if the universe isn't already sort of pushing us into that realm of introspection, you might as well use this time to go inwards and really sit with yourself and really come to terms with some of the conditioning that you know that you've taken with you that haven't really been beneficial to the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And take this time as an opportunity to change the narrative a little bit. You know, look at all the areas of your life where maybe you could have showed up more for other people.
Absolutely.
Where you could have maybe taken better care of yourself. Mm-hmm. Where you could have, you know, not taken certain things for granted.
Yeah.
And use that time to really almost rebuild a new you. Mm-hmm. So the dark night collectively being that God came into not only our spiritual homes, he came into our entire city and destroyed the entire city when we all thought that he would come in and just do some work on the freeways, you know?
Yeah.
So because that sort of reckoning is happening, I think a large part of our responsibility is to pay it forward by creating a better, more sustainable version of ourselves so that we could enter into this new world and adapt to change and, you know, see if we can do this again, but in a more loving and cohesive and dynamic way where we're paying homage and respect to nature, to each other, and we can create more of that world that we want to live in, which is a balanced world.
Yeah. Have you read the articles about how much the environment has benefited from people not driving to work every day, being on the streets?
I haven't.
You haven't?
I saw the headlines on some of those.
So the headlines, I mean, the headlines are really good. And I mean, just the high note, right, is that there's less cars on the freeways. Right. So there's not as many greenhouse gases. The plants and vegetation are growing so much better.
Right.
The air pollution, water pollution, so much better since people have been quarantined.
Yeah.
So I don't know, there's some benefits. There's a couple benefits. Getting
Those
to
are
know
a lot of
yourself,
benefits,
maybe getting to know the people in your household. I mean, there's a lot of parents that become so disconnected from their children because their kids are on their phones and social media, and then the parents are, at work and then coming home and trying to, get everyone in the shower and get dinner cooked and all the parent things.
Right.
So you end up living in a house with people that you don't really know.
Yeah.
So now you can't get away from them.
Right.
And it's a great time to recenter yourself and change those relationships.
I agree with you. And I think this is about our affiliation with nature. Mm-hmm. If we didn't take it upon ourselves to really do the work, nature will just stop you in your tracks. Because that's the one thing that we don't realize, that the natural selection isn't just for animals.
No. Nope.
Like that includes us too.
Yeah.
And so it's just showing like reverence and really atonement and appreciation for Mother Gaia, because this is her home. Mm-hmm. And we are just visiting,
Yeah.
And we're also even just borrowing the bodies that we have that are going to return back to her.
Yeah.
So it really calls for some radical accountability on our end to pay our respects to her, So, yeah. So everybody stay safe out there. Really buckle down on your meditations, do some reading. We'll all go through this. We're all actually going through this together. Mm-hmm. And it's all love. We have the divine spirit. We have our angels. We have our guides. We have our friends. We have our loved ones all with us, supporting. And we'll come out of this much stronger, much more aware, and much more beautiful.
Agreed.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you guys for tuning in to the Divine Nobodies podcast. You can find us on YouTube. You could also find us on Instagram at divine Nobodies podcast. And then also too, you can go to our actual website, which is www.divine-nobodies.com. Definitely please like and subscribe if you want to hear more episodes like this on Apple Podcasts as well as on YouTube. I would really appreciate it. If you have any questions, you could also send us a question on our website.
Yeah.
I think I covered everything, right?
Yeah, you did. And any show recommendations? We're interested.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Reach out to us. But have a good weekend. We'll talk to you soon. Namaste.